I strongly believe there's a difference between making a point and being so convinced you're right that you'll risk everything to prove it. What's up? Nathan Cole here, and this is what I'm looking at today. From a Karen obsessed with avoiding tap water to a Karen repeatedly crawling beneath a neighbor's deck where she'd get hurt in a way that would only get worse. It was March 14th, 2016, in Clallam County, Washington. The kind of place where the tree line never really ends, and the ground stays damp even in the middle of summer. Most people out there have a quiet appreciation for the land, and honestly, I get it. Maria Fentress had something closer to an obsession. Maria was 41, married, with 2 teenagers still in the house. She worked part-time doing bookkeeping for a local contracting firm. Nothing glamorous, but steady. The job paid the bills. What really occupied her time, though, was everything she'd decided to put into her body and everything she'd decided to keep out of it. Organic produce, homemade everything, zero processed food. That part wasn't unusual for the area. Plenty of people out there lived the same way. But Maria had a specific target by late 2015, and that target was tap water. She was convinced, genuinely, deeply convinced, that municipal water was doing more harm than good. Overtreated, chemically loaded, unfit for human consumption. She'd bring it up at neighborhood gatherings, hand out printed articles, work it into conversations that had nothing to do with water in the first place. And look, I'm not here to tell anyone what to drink, but there's a difference between being cautious and being certain. What pushed her over the edge, and I mean that almost literally, was when she started treating her tap water crusade like a public service. She wasn't just changing her own habits anymore. She was on a mission to convert people. Printed handouts at the grocery store, unsolicited water quality, lectures at school pickup. She had a whole binder, an actual binder, with tabs. Sometime in early 2016, she found a spring source about 2 miles out, off a rural access road cutting through a wooded area. Clear water running over rocks, cold, completely undisturbed looking. To Maria, it was exactly what she'd been looking for. She started hauling it back in jugs, first just for herself, then for her family, then for neighbors who were willing to take some. She talked about it the way people talk about a discovery they can't believe the rest of the world hasn't caught up to yet. By February, she had cut out everything else entirely. No tap, no filtered water, no bottled water. Just the spring. She was proud of that fact and made sure people knew it. When a neighbor suggested she get the water tested, Maria cut her off mid-sentence and said that was exactly the kind of fear-based thinking the water treatment industry depended on. And according to her, it was a question of whether people trusted corporations or had any common sense left at all. What nobody knew, including Maria, was that the water wasn't clean. The land surrounding that spring had significant animal activity, and runoff had introduced leptospira bacteria into the source. Leptospirosis isn't something most people can identify on sight because there's nothing to see. The water looks fine. It tastes fine. The infection it causes targets the kidneys and liver, and by the time symptoms show up clearly enough to raise alarms, it's often already progressed further than it should have. That's the part that gets me every time. There's no warning you'd actually notice. The first signs appeared in early March. Fever, body aches, fatigue. Maria told people it was just something going around, which, honestly, makes sense. Those early symptoms don't point anywhere specific. A lot of people would have assumed the same thing and waited it out, but by the second week her skin had yellowed, noticeably. She was exhausted in a way that sleep wasn't fixing. Her lower back had started hurting in a way she couldn't explain away. She showed up to a neighborhood meeting on March 12th, 2 days before she died. People there described her as visibly off, pale, moving slowly, not engaging the way she usually did. Someone asked if she was feeling okay. She said she was fine, a little too sharply, and steered the conversation back to the water, asking if anyone had actually looked at what they were drinking lately, or if they just trusted whatever came out of the tap. She'd brought a jug of it to share. Nobody took any. And I don't know if that detail is sad or just haunting, but it's stuck with me. She collapsed at home on the morning of March 14th. The county medical examiner confirmed leptospirosis, kidney and liver failure, caused by prolonged exposure to the contaminated spring she'd been drinking from exclusively for weeks. The source was tested shortly after and came back positive for the bacteria. It had been there the whole time. Every trip out to that access road, every jug she filled, every neighbor she tried to convince. No third-party fault was found. The spring had no owner. No one had flagged it before Maria started using it, so no warnings had ever been posted. The case was closed quietly. Maria Fentress died believing she had found something better, and that spring never did get a warning sign. The next one genuinely caught me off guard. A woman who couldn't stand being told she'd had enough time in a tanning bed. It was October 3rd, 2015, in Denton County, Texas. The kind of suburb where every strip mall looks the same, and there's a gym on practically every other block. Nothing about the area stood out. Neither did Gail Pitsley, at least not at first. Gail was 38 years old and worked as an office administrator for a mid-sized logistics company. Monday through Friday, same desk, same hours. She was organized, punctual, and by most accounts easy enough to work with as long as things went her way. Outside of work, the gym was her thing, had been for years. She went 5 days a week without fail, and the tanning bed was as much a part of her routine as the elliptical. Maintaining her tan wasn't vanity to Gail, or at least that's not how she saw it. It was upkeep, part of the program, non-negotiable. The facility she used had a standard policy, 12 minutes per session, with a mandatory 24-hour gap between visits. Basic stuff, put in place to prevent the kind of cumulative skin damage that builds up faster than most people realize. Gail knew the policy. She just didn't think it applied to her. She complained about it regularly, to the front desk staff, to whoever was nearby, to people who hadn't asked. 12 minutes wasn't enough. The wait period was excessive. She'd been tanning for years and nothing bad had ever happened. So clearly she knew her own limits better than any laminated sign on a wall did. I mean, I've heard that logic before, and it never ends well. Staff had cut her session short on more than one occasion after she refused to come out on her own. There were documented complaints filed against her going back several months. At some point in late September 2015, she figured out that the facility's side entrance used a keypad code that hadn't been changed in over a year. She started letting herself in after closing. No staff, no timers, no one to tell her when she'd had enough. The access logs told most of the story afterward. She had entered after hours at least a dozen times across roughly 3 weeks, staying well beyond any duration a supervised session would have allowed. Some entries showed her inside for over an hour at a stretch. She wasn't testing boundaries. She had thrown them out entirely. The first sign that something was wrong came from her co-workers. Around mid-October, people at her office started noticing that her skin looked unusual, not tan, damaged. Red in uneven patches, peeling in others, with areas along her shoulders and forearms that looked raw and irritated. Gail brushed it off, said she'd just overdone it a little and that it would settle down on its own. She kept coming to work. She kept going to the gym, though there were no official tanning session records after the 3rd week of October. Only keypad entry logs tied to her after-hours access. By late October, she had stopped showing up to the office entirely. A co-worker who called to check on her described her as sounding exhausted and difficult to follow in conversation. The skin damage had progressed significantly by that point. The burned areas across her back and shoulders had broken down into open wounds, and without any medical treatment, those wounds had become severely infected. Bacteria entering the bloodstream through compromised skin is one of the more straightforward paths to sepsis, and Gail had left that path wide open. For weeks, she was found unresponsive at her residence on October 24th, 2015. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as sepsis resulting from infected radiation burns across a significant portion of her upper body. The skin breakdown had been extensive enough that the infection spread quickly once it took hold, progressing to multi-organ failure before anyone knew how serious her condition had become. The facility's access records were reviewed as part of the process and confirmed the pattern of unauthorized after-hours entries. Every visit was logged with a timestamp. No fault was found on the part of the facility. The sessions Gail had complained about for months, the ones she called unreasonable and excessive, had been designed to prevent exactly what her autopsy described. The case was closed without further findings. She broke every limit that room had, and her skin gave out long before she was willing to admit anything was wrong. I've covered some reckless decisions on this channel The next one involves a woman who spent hours in extreme heat measuring her neighbors' lawns. It was July 18th, 2017, in Maricopa County, Arizona, the kind of place that doesn't apologize for its summers. That week had been sitting at or above 115 degrees for days straight, and the heat advisories had been consistent. Stay inside, stay hydrated, limit outdoor exposure to the early morning hours if you had to go out at all. Most people were listening. Ruth Ann Woolman was 62 years old and had been retired for about 3 years. She'd spent most of her working life as an administrative coordinator for a property management company. And when she moved into her corner house in a planned residential community, she brought that same energy with her, just without the paycheck or the authority. She had a clear sight line to 3 different streets from her front window, and she treated that view like a post. For 8 years, she'd been the self-appointed compliance officer for her homeowners association, measuring tape in her bag at all times, camera always charged, notebook always open. The HOA had a formal inspection process, scheduled walkthroughs, documented procedures, a committee that handled findings. Ruth Ann had been part of that committee for years, but by 2017, the other members had quietly started routing things around her after a series of complaints that went nowhere, and a few that had actually created legal headaches for the association. She hadn't been formally removed. She'd just been sidelined, and she knew it. That's the part I think matters here. What happened on July 18th wasn't random. It was a response to being told in so many ways that her input wasn't needed anymore. Earlier that week, a neighbor 2 doors down had submitted a self-reported lawn measurement to the HOA that Ruth Ann believed was inaccurate. She'd raised it with the committee. They reviewed it and closed it without action. That was apparently the last straw. On the morning of July 18th at just after 8 a.m., Ruth Ann left her house with her measuring tape, her clipboard, and her camera. The temperature was already pushing 97 degrees. She had told a neighbor the evening before that she was going to do a full street-by-street inspection herself, since nobody else was going to do it right. The neighbor told her to wait until it cooled down. Ruth Ann said she'd be fine. She wasn't fine. She was out there for close to 4 hours. Neighbors saw her working her way down the block, crouching to measure grass height, photographing driveways, writing in her notebook. Multiple people came outside to check on her. One brought out a bottle of water. Another asked her to come in and sit in the air conditioning for a few minutes. She turned all of it down. By late morning, the temperature had crossed 112 degrees. Witnesses said she had slowed considerably. She was stopping more often, standing still with her hand on her knee, taking longer between properties. One neighbor who watched from her window said Ruth Ann looked like she was moving through something thick. She kept going. At approximately 12:20 p.m., a resident on the far end of the street found Ruth Ann on the ground in front of his mailbox. She was unresponsive. He called for emergency help immediately and stayed with her until responders arrived. Her skin was dry, which, in that kind of heat, is actually a bad sign. It means the body has stopped sweating, which means it's stopped trying to cool itself down. Responders worked on her at the scene. Her core temperature was recorded at 107 degrees. She did not recover. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as hyperthermia with severe dehydration as a contributing factor. Prolonged physical exertion in extreme heat without fluid intake. Her clipboard was recovered at the scene, still in her hand. The notes on it covered 11 properties. Of those 11, not a single one was actually in violation of HOA guidelines. The measurements she'd recorded were all within limits. No fault was assigned to any other party. Multiple witnesses confirmed that assistance had been offered and refused. The case was closed as an accidental death. The HOA formally suspended all non-emergency outdoor inspections during heat advisory periods in the weeks that followed. Ruth Ann died measuring grass in deadly heat because she couldn't let go of imaginary violations. What I find even more telling is our next case, someone who decided she understood traffic better than the people actually driving in it. If you're still here after that one, go ahead and subscribe. You're definitely going to want the next ones. It was April 9th, 2017, in Gwinnett County, Georgia. a busy stretch of suburban road where the morning commute backed up without fail and pedestrian crossings were more suggestion than structure. The intersection at the center of this story sat between a residential block and a commercial strip, and it moved a steady volume of traffic from the moment the sun came up. Cheryl Cruthers was 54 years old and had lived 2 blocks from that intersection for 11 years. She had retired from a long career in office management and spent most of her time at home, which meant she had more hours in the day than most people to notice things that bothered her. And that intersection bothered her enormously. She had filed complaints with local traffic authorities on multiple occasions about the signal timing, about drivers running the light, about pedestrians nearly getting clipped in the crosswalk. A few of those complaints got acknowledgement letters. None of them got action, at least not fast enough for Cheryl. Her neighbors knew her as someone who cared deeply about the neighborhood and had very little patience for anyone who didn't share that level of care. She was vocal, persistent, and not particularly interested in being told that something was outside her control. When the official channels stopped producing results, Cheryl decided to produce her own. You know what I find fascinating about people like Cheryl? They always think they're the solution to problems that nobody asked them to solve. Sometime in late March 2017, she began stationing herself at the intersection during the morning rush. No vest, no official designation, nothing beyond her own certainty that she knew how traffic should move. She would step into the road to wave pedestrians through, hold up a hand to stop turning vehicles, and position herself in the middle of the crosswalk like she had every authority in the world to be there. She did this every weekday morning for roughly 2 weeks. A few had told her directly that she was going to get herself hurt. Cheryl's response, by multiple accounts, was that somebody had to do it. Can you imagine being so convinced you're right that you'd literally stand in traffic to prove it? By the second week, her presence at the intersection had become predictable enough that some drivers expected her and slowed down accordingly. That predictability, as it turned out, worked against her. On the morning of April 9th, the commute was moving the way it usually did. Steady flow. No major backups yet. Cheryl was in her usual spot near the crosswalk, managing pedestrians the way she had been for days. At approximately 7:40 a.m., she stepped beyond the marked crosswalk and into the outer travel lane to stop a right-turning vehicle, which was something witnesses had seen her do before. What she didn't account for was a second vehicle coming through the intersection from the opposite direction at the same moment. The driver had a green light and no reason to expect a pedestrian in that part of the road. By the time Cheryl moved into that lane, she was less than 2 car lengths away. The driver braked but didn't have enough distance. The impact was at reduced speed but still fatal. Cheryl was death, struck on her left side and went down immediately. Several commuters who witnessed the collision pulled over. One stayed with her until emergency personnel arrived. The driver remained at the scene and was visibly shaken. Witnesses were consistent in their accounts. Cheryl had stepped into the path of oncoming traffic while attempting to direct a separate vehicle. Cheryl Cruthers was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma resulting in internal hemorrhaging, consistent with a vehicle strike at low to moderate speed. The responding authorities reviewed witness statements and traffic camera footage from a nearby commercial property. The footage confirmed what witnesses had already described. The driver was not charged. The investigation closed within weeks, with the determination that Cheryl had placed herself in the path of a vehicle operating lawfully within the intersection. No traffic authority had sanctioned her presence there at any point. Her complaints about the intersection, the ones she had been filing for years, were found on record. The signal timing was reviewed shortly after her death. Adjustments were made the following month. Cheryl died trying to be the traffic control she thought her neighborhood needed, armed with nothing but good intentions and terrible judgment. But I'm about to tell you about a woman whose paranoia about her neighbor's deck led her to crawl around in dangerous conditions for weeks. It was October 2016, and the suburbs of Delaware County, Pennsylvania, were experiencing their usual fall construction season. Homeowners were rushing to complete outdoor projects before winter, and the sound of hammers and power tools echoed through residential neighborhoods as people added decks, sheds, and other improvements to their properties. Janice Greber was a 58-year-old insurance claims processor who'd lived in the same house for over 15 years. She worked from home most days, which gave her plenty of time to monitor everything happening in her neighborhood. Janice had always been meticulous about following rules and regulations, and she expected the same from everyone around her. When her next-door neighbor started building a large deck in his backyard that spring, Janice became convinced he was doing it without proper permits. What really bothers me about Janice's story is how a simple property dispute turned into a dangerous obsession. She'd called the township multiple times to report the construction, but officials told her the permits were in order. That wasn't good enough for Janice. She was absolutely certain they were wrong, and she was determined to prove it. She started taking photos of the construction from every angle, measuring distances from her own yard, and documenting what she believed were code violations. The deck was completed in late summer, but Janice's investigation was just getting started. She'd convinced herself that the foundation wasn't built to code and that the support beams were improperly spaced. The only way to prove it, she decided, was to get underneath the structure and take detailed measurements herself. So in early October, Janice began crawling under her neighbor's deck on a regular basis. And then this is the part where things get really disturbing. Janice made this a routine. Every few days, when her neighbor wasn't home, she'd squeeze through the gap between the deck and the ground to examine the construction from below. The space was cramped, filled with old construction debris, and definitely not designed for human access. But Janice was convinced she was gathering crucial evidence that would vindicate her complaints. During one of these unauthorized inspections in mid-October, Janice punctured her right hand on a rusty nail that was protruding from a piece of old lumber left under the deck. The wound was deep and jagged, exactly the kind of injury that requires immediate medical attention and a tetanus shot. But Janice was more concerned about explaining how she got the injury and admitting she'd been trespassing than she was about the cut. She cleaned it with water from a garden hose, wrapped it with a dirty cloth, and went home. Over the next week, Janice's hand became increasingly painful and stiff. She attributed the discomfort to stress from her ongoing battle with the neighbor and kept applying basic first aid. What she didn't realize was that the rusty nail had introduced tetanus bacteria into the wound through the deep puncture. By the time the characteristic jaw stiffness appeared 10 days later, the infection had already taken hold. Janice's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days. The muscle spasms started in her jaw and neck, then spread throughout her body. Her family members noticed she was having trouble speaking and eating, but Janice insisted it was just tension from dealing with the permit situation. When the spasms became severe enough to affect her breathing, her sister finally convinced her to seek medical help. By the time Janice reached the emergency room, the tetanus infection had progressed too far for effective treatment. Despite aggressive medical intervention, including muscle relaxants and respiratory support, she died from respiratory failure caused by severe tetanus-induced muscle spasms. The medical examiner confirmed tetanus as the cause of death, with the puncture wound from the rusty nail identified as the source of infection. Janice's obsessive documentation of her neighbor's deck was found in her home office. Hundreds of photos, measurements, and notes that proved absolutely nothing. Township records confirmed that all permits for the deck construction had been properly obtained and that the work met all local building codes. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by tetanus infection resulting from an untreated puncture wound sustained during unauthorized entry onto private property.